Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to the Return of the King podcast. My name is Joe Murrow, your humble host. I am today tackling a topic that has been going back and forth for the past week, an exchange between Tim Gordon and Joe Heschmeyer. And I'm just going to give my 3 cents to the whole conversation and throw some thoughts into it. From what I gathered, it started by a clip of Joe Heschmeyer on Catholic Answers responding to a woman who had asked him a question about, had to do with wifely submission, and essentially had to do with her husband making a car purchase, and she was wondering if she was in error by not sharing with the husband that she disagreed in some capacity with the purchase. Now, the clip, which I'll show here on the podcast,
is a model of headship that I think is expressed well in a letter that a woman named Mary wrote to Pastor John Piper, in which she says, "I know that submission is a requirement of the wife, and I've been working hard lately to hold my tongue and agree with my husband even when I have a different opinion." In her letter, she goes on to ask if she's erred by going along with her husband's decision to unwisely buy a new car, even when she knew he was making a mistake. So that's the first model of headship. I mean, something like the husband makes all the decisions. The wife's role is just to hold her tongue or to agree with him, even if she really knows he's wrong.
The clip itself is a bit vague. There's a lot of detail not given, right, to the specifics of the scenario. A lot of detail wasn't given by the wife. And I ran this scenario by several different people to get their take on it. They all kind of had the same thought process, which was there's a lot of context that we don't know, which kind of makes it a bit difficult, right, to give a good response to it. There'd have to be some follow-up questions to really understand best what the scenario is. Okay. But anyways, Joe Heschmeyer's response to this woman caused Tim Gordon to do a podcast response, so like a full hour type thing on this brief clip of Joe Heschmeyer responding to this woman. And so Gordon put out a full response video to what Heschmeyer said, and that prompted Joe Heschmeyer to then respond to Tim Gordon with like a 9-minute video clarifying, confirming what his thought was to it and why he disagreed with Gordon's reaction or response. And then that caused Gordon to do a second follow-up video, right, another hour roughly, responding to Joe Heschmeyer. So I, initially did not see these as they were airing, but I had a friend, specifically a certain friend, and I had others as well, sending me information, and letting me know their thoughts and asking me what my thoughts were on all this back and forth. So I had to kind of catch up to speed on what was going on. And that's what kind of then caused the idea for my podcast to kind of weigh in and give my 3 cents on it. So those of you that are familiar with Return the King podcast, may know that about a year ago, a brother of Christ of mine named Jesse Evans and I collaborated on 2 podcasts back to back called What a Woman Is Not, Part 1 and 2. And between those 2 podcasts, it was well over 4 hours of content. Each podcast went over about 2 hours, from what I remember. On those podcasts, we were critiquing a whole host of things that, we saw that were erroneous from Tim Gordon's position in regards to marriage, specifically involving marital intimacy and all sorts of things, and what a wife's obligations are. A big part of it being our concern, being the lens by which he views the situation, by which he views women, and his understanding of, what the authority of a husband is. And so we were sharing our thoughts on it about a year ago, and that was over 4 hours of podcasting. So I bring that out because a lot of what I'm going to share on this podcast, it definitely would help if the person watching this, if you've seen those 2 podcasts from a year ago, because a lot of ground was covered on a foundational level in regards to some of our big concerns with Tim Gordon and his approach to things. On those podcasts, we also do a full watch along and a review of the original trailer of Timothy Gordon's documentary, which got postponed by months. It was supposed to be released, I think, last February, and I heard it's going to be releasing, I think, soon, within the next few days or weeks or something, what have you. But Originally, he had put out that trailer promoting his documentary on what a woman is, and we did a full watch along and full commentary on all the things that we agreed with, and then the parts that we very much severely disagreed with, because, and this, again, there's much more context in those podcasts from a year ago, but what it comes down to is that, the parts of Tim Gordon that are, fine, okay, for anti-feminism is a good thing, right? Feminism is an error. No problem with that whatsoever. Anti-male effeminacy, also a good thing, right? The cultural push towards the rise of feminism and male effeminacy side by side, right? These are not good things. These are errors, and they need to be targeted. They need to be exposed because they're evils, okay? No issue with that whatsoever. But toxic totalitarian headship is also not a good thing. And our contention was that, Tim Gordon's approach to these two errors, feminism, male effeminacy, because these are such, extreme errors, the pendulum of his goes all the way to the other end in trying to oppose it, right? But in doing that, he leads down different trails that aren't good for husbands, aren't good for marriages, aren't good for women. In particular, his understanding, what we critiqued a lot, was his understanding of how a husband ought to be viewing his wife, So again, a lot of that you'll find in those podcasts. There's so much context in those two, and I encourage you, if you haven't yet, to watch those, okay? That'll be the first point I want to make off the bat, because what I'm going to cover here is very specific to the back and forth between Heschmeyer and Tim Gordon on this particular topic that they were talking about. But it definitely helps to have the context. We went over a lot more ground a year ago in those two podcasts. You'll get a lot from there. Another thing I want to bring up too was that one thing I've noticed in preparing notes for this podcast, okay, is that one of the sad tendencies of the modern day, there is so much paraphrasing online of saints and popes and theologians, so much. A lot of it through AI type apps or Chat GPT. And I was not even aware initially that in one of Gordon's responses to Heschmeyer, Gordon's wife, Stephanie, was going down a litany of quotes. And in doing that, I didn't even catch initially, upon first hearing, that some or most of these, if not all of them, I forget, were paraphrased quotes until people called them out on it, okay? Different people were calling them out on this, and okay, this isn't a direct quote or anything. And so it's a challenge, okay? I was seeing people respond to Tim. So one thing I need to say too is, in between this whole back and forth with Heschmeyer and Gordon, in between there was all sorts of things going on in social media about this back and forth. And Gordon was posting more things on his X account, X/Twitter, whatever, which I don't have an X, Twitter account, but friends of mine do. And a friend of mine was sharing with me some of these screenshots of what was going back and forth. There was a lot that was being said, some of which I'm going to cover in this podcast. But even then, things I was seeing people responding with, I had to, initially, even certain quotes that I had heard before, statements I'd heard from certain theologians or saints that I took for granted, like, oh yeah, I've heard so-and-so say this, right? I had to really, really dig deep and find, where's the source of the quote, right? And it was quite the task. So in fact, I came across lots of websites that weren't critiquing Gordon specifically, but there were websites that were talking about this whole wider topic of vocation, the proper roles of husbands and wives, those types of topics, right? And they would have quotes from saints or theologians, and I would have to try digging for the sources, and came to find out that, wow, they're using paraphrase quotes too. I couldn't find the actual source quote. So I spent hours and hours, in preparing for this to make sure that I was giving proper, accurate information. Because again, even I was surprised. So I just want to start off with that too. Now, one thing I want to start with, on a more personal note actually, is our personal story, meaning me and my wife, Carol Ann, on how we came to understand our roles and our vocation, okay, in marriage, and how we came to that. And I don't want to get too long, because I could probably spend an hour, of course, talking about me and Carol Ann. But one thing I want to say is that, we were very young when we got married. and we were both into our faith and studying the faith. Mainly for me, apologetics at that time. We're talking, 21 years ago. I was just really into apologetics back then. So it wasn't like I was actively studying, vocation or the roles of husbands and wives or that kind of stuff. I wasn't really into that specific type of topic at the time. We didn't have a lot of formation before marriage. Okay, not a lot was given to us. We originally were going to get married to a Novus Ordo parish, and we did an engaged encounter retreat, which was definitely much more on practical temporal concerns, but not really on, vocation again or roles of husbands and wives. Didn't really focus on that. We ended up kind of last minute shifting things to a Latin mass that we found and a very, a traditional priest. But it was a last minute change, and the priest got to know us and approved, being, he agreed to marry us. But even so, we didn't even have much time with him with formation. He gave us a book that we could read to help us out. One thing that always stuck with me that he shared with us was a good marriage, a holy marriage is like a dance. One leads and one follows. If both try to lead, the dance looks disastrous. But if one leads and one follows, it looks beautiful and majestic. And that always stayed with me and Carol Ann. But, getting married young, and learning the faith in a sense together, we were simultaneously learning new things by the day at times about our faith. And there was a lot we had to learn about our roles as husband and wife, a lot. There was so much we just didn't know, so much I didn't know. And it wasn't like I, was rushing to the bookstore to find books on patriarchy or the evils of feminism. It just wasn't an interest of mine. It wasn't for a long time. But what I will say is that learning through trial and error, over the years, here's what kept us grounded. One was our understanding of Ephesians 5 was very important. That was a pivotal passage for us. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. Wives, submit to your husbands, right? As the church submits to Christ, of course. And us spending years reflecting on what that means. What does it mean for me to love my wife the way Christ loved his church and gave his life for her? What does it mean for Carol Ann to submit to me? And what does that entail of me as a husband for her to truly submit? What does that mean for me? Am I trustworthy? Am I a man that, that leads her to heaven? Am I striving for virtue? All sorts of things. We reflected a lot in that passage over the years. But really what helped us out a lot, and again, I didn't watch any patriarchy documentary or any documentary about why feminism's evil. It was really just our growth and our devotions, me and Carol Ann, on my end to St. Joseph and on her end to the Blessed Mother, which is what I encourage men and women, husbands and wives, even to this day. I never have books I throw at them saying, hey, this discusses patriarchy, or this discusses why feminism is evil, or this discusses why women need to be submissive. I don't throw books or documents like that at them at all. I encourage men to foster a true devotion to St. Joseph. That devotion will show them what it means to be a man and to be a husband, right? Trustworthy, virtuous, chivalrous husband. And I encourage women and ladies to foster a devotion to Our Lady, to the Blessed Mother, right? Because she will show true femininity. And of course, both sides, men and women, consecrate yourselves to our Lord through the Blessed Mother, of course, because through St. Louis de Montfort's method is the one that I recommend. That's the gold standard. Because Our Lady is the Queen of Saints, right? She will and she will mold us into being saints and will conform us to Christ crucified. So insofar as we're growing in virtue and growing in holiness and going to spiritual combat against our vices day to day, and we're trying to combat venial sin, and we're frequenting the sacraments, all these things, right? God will bring out of that. He will reap a harvest, this good fruit of what it means to be a leader of a family, what it means to submit, and and how that blends so beautifully with self-sacrificial love on both ends. That's what I would recommend, and that's how we came to understand over the years what it meant. Our vocation, our roles within marriage, right? So just something I want to share off the bat. So, what is proper headship and proper submission of husband and wife? This comes from an article actually that I wrote at our website, returntheking.live, which you can go there and do a search. Just search the word headship of husband, or submission of wife, and the article will pull right up. But in that article I wrote, I said, pay close attention to the beautiful teaching of Pope Pius XI regarding the true role of the wife in marriage. And Pope Pius XI in Casti Connubii said, if the man is the head, the woman is the heart. Very beautiful statement from our Holy Father. And I wrote, this was composed in his magnificent encyclical Casti Connubii. We ought to reflect frequently on how this sentiment is reflected in our marriages. Husband is the head, the wife is the heart. This explains why I wrote earlier that every wise husband knows intuitively to beseech his bride for her insight as well, and he ought to give it precedence above all else in his own ongoing discernment for decisions which impact the family. And as the heart, the wife carries the noble dignity of bringing life to the family through her grace and prayers, right? So you should know off the bat. I mean, again, I recommend at the start of this podcast to go back and listen to my podcast from last year with Jesse Evans on Tim Gordon, to the two different ones, 4 hours. Also go back and check out in the playlists on Return the King podcast at YouTube, the Catholic Masculinity Crisis series. There's a lot of content in those episodes that pertain to what it means to be a man in our vocation, what it means to be a husband, what it means to be trustworthy. I have one particular episode called on trust and submission that would be very important to listen to. But I go through a lot of this stuff, the virtue of chivalry. Check out my Iron Sharpens Iron series, which is me and a group of different guys, and we're all talking about different types of virtues for Catholic men and different things. And, you know, we handle a lot of these topics. But one thing people that know me know I'm an advocate for is I'm a big advocate for, yes, the husband is the head, right? No disagreement there, okay? Everything Tim had to say in his podcast against Joe Heschmeyer about, the man makes the decisions and the prudential judgments and all, there's no issue with this whatsoever, right? On an objective basis, fine. It makes perfect sense. I make the decisions for our family, okay? Carol Ann knows this. Like I've said in previous podcasts, it's not like I ever had to sit Carol Ann down at some point in our marriage and say, well, time to discuss your level of submissiveness, right? It never had to happen, right? She intuitively submitted to me and trusted me. It flowed as easy as water for her because she trusted me. She saw me as a trustworthy man, a virtuous man, but also a wise, from what she's told me, a wise man, because I always factored in her insight and her God-given wisdom. Carol Ann is the wisest person I know. I believe she's on the path to being a saint as far as it goes, being a wife. Why wouldn't I inquire of her, what has God put in your heart? What are your thoughts to things? I factor that into my discernment on the big issues, okay? On big important topics pertaining to our marriage. I have to make the decision. She abides by it, but I will always factor in to the highest degree what she has to say, what her thoughts are, her concerns, her worries, her questions, her prayers, her insights, because she's the wisest woman I know. Again, I believe she's firmly on the path to being a saint. And even my own spiritual director says the same thing about her. Why wouldn't I inquire of Carol Ann, what are your thoughts on this topic? So I will factor that in, and it will weigh heavy on me in my discernment, in my pros and cons, right? I'll take it all to prayer, and I will come out with a decision. Sometimes it goes in her favor from what she said, sometimes it doesn't. Either way, she trusts me in it. But of course I factor in what she has to say. And I think this was a big thing that was missing from what I hear from Timothy Gordon, right? This whole concept of his of, I make the decision, you just listen to it, almost like if I want your opinion, I'll let you know, and whatever I decide, you better smile and go along with it. It's like I don't find virtue in that. I don't find chivalry in that. That's just, again, it's not the advice I give to husbands, that type of approach, right? Another issue I had with Tim Gordon was he basically, in his responses to Heschmeyer, started doing this thing of calling him a Christian feminist, right? Essentially meaning that anyone who disagrees with Tim Gordon's particular views must be a feminist, right? So Gordon makes himself the standard on these topics. He makes himself the standard, and if you don't meet his standard, you're a feminist. And I've told people, no, don't make your standard Tim Gordon or any influencer, including me. Make your standard Saint Joseph and the saints, right? That should be the standard. Our Lord, Saint Joseph, and the saints. That's the standard to go by, okay? Tim Gordon is wrong to label anyone who disagrees with him as a Christian feminist off the bat, because disagreeing with somebody does not make you a feminist, okay? You can understand the errors of feminism and not subscribe to them and still disagree with Timothy Gordon's approach to things, okay? Misusing the term, all it does is confuse people about what the real error actually is, because from a Catholic viewpoint, feminism is the false ideology that rejects or distorts the God-given differences between men and women. It denies the divinely established hierarchy that God has given to marriage, the complementarity that's taught by Scripture and tradition between husbands and wives, and it replaces those things with an egalitarian model, okay, that's rooted in radical autonomy, rather than divine authority. That's a problem with feminism. That's the evil of feminism. It treats male headship as if it's oppression, okay? And it claims that the roles of husband and wife are interchangeable, right? And elevates self-determination above vocation and the order willed by God. None of this at all applies to Catholics who simply disagree with Tim Gordon's interpretation or filter or warped lens about marriage and about wives and about women. Okay, it doesn't apply to any Catholic who disagrees with him off the bat, okay, which is what Tim Gordon says. He calls you a feminist if you disagree with him. Because what we're doing is trying to articulate the Catholic teaching on marital authority, and especially its limits. We're not promoting feminism. Okay, Joe Heschmeyer was not promoting feminism whatsoever in what he had to say. Okay, we're trying to remain faithful to the church, right? And pastorally as well, right? And we're trying to grow in virtue, right? We're trying to be virtuous husbands, okay? That's the important part. The saints explicitly teach that a husband's authority, yes, it's real. That doesn't mean it's absolute, all right? It cannot contradict prudence. It cannot demand obedience in unreasonable or sinful matters, obviously, which Gordon himself admitted in regards to sin. Okay, so he agrees with that. So that isn't feminism, okay? We're just trying to abide by Catholic moral theology and wise principles, okay, of what it means to self-sacrificially love your wife and to lay down your life for her and to be a saint in the context of your marriage, okay? So by branding all disagreement across the board as Christian feminism, like by Gordon saying, if you don't agree with me, then you're a Christian feminist, then by doing that, Tim avoids engaging the real arguments being offered. By Joe Heschmeyer, myself, and others, for example, he substitutes labels for reasoning, and he misrepresents faithful Catholics whose positions fall squarely within the traditional understanding of our faith and of vocation, of the roles of husband and wife, okay? So it's not accurate or intellectually honest to collapse every nuance of our faith into a single insult, right? True error has to be defined very precisely, okay? The error of feminism must be defined very precisely, and true doctrine has to be represented very faithfully, and not just dismissed off the bat with an ideological name calling like what Tim Gordon does, okay? Now, you'll notice on this podcast, the cover photo shows the Wizard of Oz. Why the imagery to Oz? I chose to do this for two reasons. One, a bit half-hearted or lighthearted, because I noticed that Gordon and Heschmeyer were doing this back and forth as well. They were utilizing Wizard of Oz imagery. So I thought, you know what? I should just jump in and do the same thing, right? That was the first part. The second part, because much like the Wizard of Oz, right, the character of the Wizard of Oz, who is, has a booming voice and smoke and fire, much like that, Tim presents his position as if it represents the full weight of Catholic tradition. Boom, there it is. Okay, but when you pull back the curtain and actually read Pius XI, read the saints, read moral theologians, you discover that there's not much behind the spectacle of what Tim is putting out in these podcasts, okay? In his, very, like I said, his very particular position that goes from this all the way over here, and he expects everyone to meet him over here or else type thing, all right? That's why I use the imagery of the Wizard of Oz. As I said, the standard for men ought to always be St. Joseph and our Lord. So Gordon at times says things that are good on the surface at times, okay? And we mentioned this in our podcast last year, all right? But he has a warped lens very often how he applies those things. That's the deeper problem, okay? And that makes it damaging and at times literally degrading when it comes to women and when it comes to wives, okay? When truth is taken to an unwarranted extreme, the key word being unwarranted, it no longer represents the truth. That's just the facts for what they are, okay? Tim says that the wife may not disobey simply because she disagrees on a prudential matter, but there is nuance and there are caveats to this that are very important to understand, okay? Because she cannot obey, obviously, if the command involves sin, which Gordon said over and over again several times in this podcast, and also she cannot obey if it goes against right reason, according to Pius XI, which is what Heschmeyer brought up, and I'm going to dig into that very specifically as well in this podcast. I'll discuss right reason, such as a husband, I'll have a few different examples, but just to give you one off the bat, like a husband that wants to squander money on an impractical purchase, and the wife disagrees with him on this and chooses to let him know that she disagrees with him, okay? That's a basic example right there. I also want to make sure I explain that, yes, wives are called to be submissive, which is a virtuous thing, but they also have God-given wisdom and a voice that God's given them, that a husband, if he is wise, ought to consult in his factoring in of a decision. Okay, there's no reason why not to, unless you don't think your wife possesses that kind of wisdom. I know mine does, and I've learned much from my wife. Okay, I really have. So again, she's the heart of our marriage, right? As Pius XI said. I felt that watching Tim's responses to Heschmeyer, the 2 podcasts that he did on this topic, first responding to Heschmeyer's brief video about responding to the woman about the car purchase, and then responding to Heschmeyer's 9-minute response to him, they went in circles, completely went in circles, because as I'm watching, especially the most recent one he did, responding to Heschmeyer's 9-minute video, it went in circles because he had Stephanie, Tim Gordon's wife Stephanie, was reading off this whole litany of quotes again, which it turns out in hindsight many of them I guess were paraphrased. By the time she's going off all these quotes, this whole litany, and I'm hearing it, I'm thinking none of this disagrees with what Heschmeyer said at all. He talked quotes about the husband's authority and wife submission and husband making decisions in prudential matters. Yeah, fine, we all agree with this. Completely. Even his citation of the Roman Catechism, the Council of Trent, it's like, yeah, fine, all of us agree with this. None of us have any problem with that at all. I couldn't understand what I felt Tim was going in circles. So at one point on his X account, he put a photo of the Roman Catechism with a highlighted part, saying, well, here it is right here, and I'm reading, and I'm thinking, like, yeah, no one's disagreeing with this whatsoever. So it went a lot in circles. In fact, it was interesting because as Stephanie was reading off the quotes, apparently she was also seeing comments come in from like the live video feed that Gordon was doing, and she said several times, I'm talking several times, she said, I see people commenting here that, Joe Heschmeyer wouldn't disagree with this, and she's like, you guys are missing the point. But she said it so many times because I realized people watching this are seeing the same thing I am, which is this doesn't refute anything Heschmeyer said. That's what I mean when I say it goes in circles. I mean, Tim's own viewers were saying this. If you watch that video, which I really don't encourage anyone to watch it, but just to say if you had seen it, I mean, you see her saying that numerous times. Like, oh, I keep seeing people saying that nothing we're saying contradicts what Heschmeyer had to say or what he was saying or what he believed, or she said it several times, and that's because I think people were saying the same thing I was. Tim's not refuting anything that Joe Heschmeyer had to say, especially when it came to Pius XI, because that really was the crux what Heschmeyer was trying to respond to about right reason and the dignity of a wife according to the teaching of Pius XI and Casti Connubii, and Gordon wasn't responding to that. Okay, he just kept going on rants about, again, the husband's authority and I can make whatever prudential decision I want. It's like, I mean, you're not refuting what Heschmeyer had to say. And again, Gordon's holding to a very absolute type of position of authority. I mean, even giving the craziest scenarios, like if I want my wife to wear the same dress every day for a week, she better obey me. It's like the craziest thing. And again, a lot of guys, I'm assuming, because I know I was his husband, hear this and think, well, where does this come from? This need, to assert yourself this way, which oftentimes when I see that in guys over the years, I'm not accusing this of Tim. I don't know Tim at all, but I mean, I have counseled many husbands in the past on different things, personally, and oftentimes when I see guys that struggle with this type of stuff, there tends to be lots of insecurity there. There's something insecure in the heart of a husband who has to exercise that level of an authority, right, in the heart of their marriage. It's just not how your average husband thinks when they love their wife and value their wife's input and want to be virtuous and be a saint. Husbands don't think that way, So I don't know what the deeper thing is, where that comes from with Gordon's approach, okay? But yeah, so I thought it went in circles because the reality is we all agree on the normative objective teaching. Husband's leader of the family. He, makes final decisions on prudential matters. I mean, all of us agree on this, okay? The question had to do with any possibility of exceptions such as sin and right reason. Okay, that's really what it broke down to. No one disagrees with the objective. When I say no one, meaning like, people like me or Heschmeyer or others that I could see. All right, again, we're not talking to secular progressive married couples or lukewarm Catholic married couples, right? That's not even Tim's audience for the most part, right? You're talking to Catholic marriages, and in the context of Heschmeyer's original video, a wife who wants to be virtuous. Okay, and she was actually wondering the opposite, and she wasn't worried about saying something. She was worried, am I committing sin by not saying something to my husband? You see, which shows you her level of understanding of how much she values her husband's role and understanding her role. Okay, but Gordon goes on these lecture rants like to husbands like me and others about what we're supposed to be doing in our marriages, Well, it's like, look, you don't have to worry about us. Okay, we're trying to be virtuous husbands, and we look to Saint Joseph as our model, right? And many of us have wives that are striving to imitate the Blessed Mother. Like I know mine is. Okay, so don't need to worry about, hey, I told you to wear the same outfit for 5 days. You're not obeying me. I don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. All right. So some of the stuff off the bat, but the Roman Catechism talks about, of course, the duties of a wife. And this was the point that Tim Gordon kept trying to drive home. He kept quoting over and over again, let wives never forget that next to God, they are to love their husbands. Next to God, they are to love their husbands, okay? And to respect and obey them in all things not inconsistent with Christian piety. This is the part that Gordon highlighted, okay? So let me read that again. Let wives never forget that next to God, they are to love their husbands, to respect and obey them in all things not inconsistent with Christian piety. So let's talk about, first of all, what the Catechism does not teach in this passage. It never teaches unlimited obedience. It doesn't teach blind obedience. It doesn't teach obedience contrary to reason, obedience to sin. It doesn't teach obedience to destructive or irresponsible decisions. Okay? It explicitly limits obedience to what is not inconsistent with Christian piety, which would include the moral law, prudence, justice, and right reason. All right. So, yes, wives are to respect and obey their husbands in all things not inconsistent with Christian piety. That's what the Catechism says. And we need to understand that sentence says exactly two things. And only these two things. This is what it says. Number one, the wife's obedience is real, okay, but also limited by the higher law of God. That's number one. The Catechism affirms true headship. The husband's the head of the household, which again, no one disagrees with. And the wife owes him reverence and obedience in domestic governance. Again, no one's disagreeing with this. And that means that she follows his reasonable directives. Okay, his reasonable directives. And she acknowledges his final say in household matters when he exercises authority rightly. Okay, very important caveat there. She acknowledges his final say in household matters when he exercises authority rightly. But this obedience, again, is not absolute. It's not blind. It's not servile. In all things, quote unquote, means in all matters where the husband exercises legitimate authority according to right reason, the good of the family, and Christian virtue. Not in everything a husband happens to want. That's the key difference. In all things doesn't mean everything a husband just happens to want, okay? The phrase in all things does not mean blindly, unquestioningly, even when unreasonable, even when harmful, even when contrary to virtue, when contrary against right reason, when damaging the household, when gravely imprudent, when with interior agreement at all times, okay, without question. That interpretation contradicts moral theology, okay, and the Roman Catechism's very own clause, which is, quote, not inconsistent with Christian piety. The governing phrase in this is not inconsistent with Christian piety. That's the governing phrase in the whole thing, all right? That phrase is what we would call the moral boundary line, okay, in the entire topic. It means a wife must not obey her husband whenever the command contradicts faith, contradicts morals, contradicts virtue, contradicts reason, justice, prudence, the good of children, her God-given dignity as a person, right? Christian piety means the entire moral law, plus right reason, plus the order of charity, plus virtue, plus the dignity inherent of persons. All right. So piety in this sense would include the virtue of religion, the virtue of prudence, the duty to safeguard the household, the duty to avoid scandal or harm, the duty to preserve one's own life, the duty to protect children. And so therefore, if a husband commands anything that's unreasonable, harmful, or contrary to right reason, the wife has not only the permission but the duty to not obey such a command. All right, that's the teaching of the Roman Catechism when read correctly. And this is how St. Thomas Aquinas explains this principle. All right, Aquinas teaches in the Summa Theologica, he says, quote, if a superior commands what is unlawful, the subject is not bound to obey. He also teaches the principle the subject is not bound to obey a superior in matters outside the superior's authority. He teaches indiscreet obedience obeys even in matters unlawful. Okay, hear that again. Indiscreet obedience obeys even in matters unlawful, which is a way of saying that indiscreet obedience is not virtuous. It's not virtue. Okay, so the Roman Catechism, when saying in all things, is assuming Aquinas' framework. It's all things that fall under his legitimate authority, all things consistent with reason and virtue, all things rightly ordered towards the good of the family. It is not talking about harmful imprudence, irrational demands, reckless decisions, degrading instructions, emotional manipulation, arbitrary commands, or tyranny or domination. All right. And in Casti Connubii, the Holy Father himself, Pope Pius XI, clarifies what the Church means by the word subjection, because Pope Pius XI writes, quote, "She is not to obey her husband if his requests are not in harmony with the right reason or with the dignity due to a wife." Right? He also says her subjection does not put her on a level with minors, which is something, end quote, something that Tim Gordon said in one of his video responses, that, in a sense, you can look at a wife similar to the way you would look at your, like a minor in the household, or like to your children, basically, is what he was saying, to the way that you would treat your adult children living at home. Dad can tell you what to do, and thus, in the same way, I can tell my wife what to do, okay? It's an interesting analogy that he made, because that was exactly what Pius XI writes against, right? Comparing your wife to a teenager doesn't make much sense. Okay, when Pius XI says the exact opposite in Casti Connubii. So subjection in this context does not mean childish dependence. It does not mean loss of judgment. It does not mean blind compliance. It does not mean servility, and it does not mean submission to irrationality. All right, it doesn't mean any of those things. So the Catechism statement, not inconsistent with Christian piety, includes with it not inconsistent with right reason when connected to what Pope Pius XI had to say. All right. So what does Christian piety mean in catechetical language? Okay, what does that term even mean from the Roman Catechism? Christian piety. It talks about, first, the virtue of religion, right? The wife cannot obey anything that's contrary to God. The virtue of prudence. She cannot obey something destructive, foolish, or seriously harmful. The virtue of justice. She cannot obey something that deprives children of due goods. The virtue of fortitude. She must resist unjust or harmful commands. The dignity of her state. She is a rational person, and she's not a slave. She's your wife, right? She's not a slave of the house. She is your wife, and she also has a role in the governance of the household when it comes to the children as well. That's why the husband's the head and the wife is the heart. Okay, so the Catechism literally means wives obey in everything that is morally good, prudent, reasonable, and fitting, and in nothing that contradicts reason, virtue, or the welfare of the family. All right, never means blind obedience. Okay, so when the Roman Catechism says wives obey in all things not inconsistent with Christian piety, it does not mean everything a husband wants willy-nilly. It means in everything that is truly reasonable, moral, virtuous, in order to the good of the family. The moment a command becomes irrational, harmful, degrading, reckless, unjust, or contrary to Christian virtue, it is outside his authority, and she not only may, but at times often must refuse. That's what you get when you connect the Aquinas principle to the Roman Catechism, to Pope Pius XI. Okay, when you put all those things together. And again, the funny thing is, most of the stuff is not, it's just not a day-to-day pressing thing. 99.999% of the time, this is not a pressing thing in marriages. Again, even Caroline knows I make decisions for us as a family, especially when it comes to the big matters. She abides by a decision, right? She trusts me in that, of course. But I mean, we're not. So it's just weird that Gordon harps so much on these types of things. Again, even to the point of using an example of, if I want her to wear an outfit 5 days a week, she has to type thing, which seems ridiculous to me. Like to make that one of your talking points. Or when it comes to matters of intimacy, which again was something that Jesse and I talked a lot about in our podcast last year. Okay, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be discussed on that. So I want to go through Casti Connubii, Pope Pius XI, because I really do think this is the crux of the issue. And Heschmeyer is the one that really brought this out. I think it's the most challenging thing to the lens and the filter that Tim Gordon is utilizing in his approach. Okay, this is a Pope Pius XI. I'm looking at 3 different paragraphs, 26, 27, and 28 are very important to us. I'm sorry, and 29, 4 different paragraphs. So let's go through these paragraphs together from Casti Connubii. Pope Pius XI writes, quote, "Domestic society being confirmed, therefore, by this bond of love, there should flourish in it that order of love, as St. Augustine calls it. This order includes both the primacy of the husband with regard to the wife and children, the ready subjection of the wife in her willing obedience, which the apostle commends in these words, 'Let women be subject to their husbands as to the Lord, because the husband is the head of the wife, and Christ is the head of the church.'" Paragraph 27. "This subjection, however, does not deny or take away the liberty which fully belongs to the woman, both in view of her dignity as a human person and in view of her most noble office as wife and mother and companion. nor does it bid her obey her husband's every request if not in harmony with right reason or with the dignity due to wife. Okay, really quick, end quote. That's, of course, the key phrase right there that we're talking about with everything I'm saying up to now. That's the governing principle right there, okay? Going back to Casti Connubii, nor in fine does it imply that the wife should be put on a level with those persons who in law are called minors. It was the point I was just making, okay? He goes on to write, to whom it is not customary to allow free exercise of their rights on account of their lack of mature judgment or of their ignorance of human affairs. But it forbids that exaggerated liberty which cares not for the good of the family. It forbids that in this body which is the family, the heart be separated from the head to the great detriment of the whole body and the proximate danger of ruin. For if the man is the head, the woman is the heart. And as he occupies the chief place in ruling, so she may and ought to claim for herself the chief place in love. Paragraph 28. This is very important. Listen to this one. Again, this objection of wife to husband and its degree and manner may vary according to the different conditions of persons, place, and time. In fact, if the husband neglect his duty, it falls to the wife to take his place in directing the family. But the structure of the family and its fundamental law, established and confirmed by God, must always, never, everywhere be maintained intact. Let me listen to that again. The subjection of the wife to the husband and its degree and manner may vary according to the different conditions of persons, place, and time. Now listen to this. In fact, if the husband neglect his duty, it falls to the wife to take his place in directing the family. It's a very important, critical point in this entire discussion. Even Pius XI recognizes that the wife, in a sense, is second in command when it comes to those things. It also implies that a husband can't fail in his duty. He can neglect it, even in matters of prudence. Okay, that's why the head and the heart balance one another. Okay, so even though, yes, the standard objective norm is the objective norm, there's nuance in these discussions. That's what Pius XI is bringing out. All right. Paragraph 29. With great wisdom, our predecessor Leo XIII of happy memory in the encyclical on Christian marriage, speaking of this order to be maintained between man and wife, teaches, quote, the man is the ruler of the family, the head of the woman, because she is flesh of his flesh and bone of his bone, let her be subject and obedient to the man, not as a servant, but as a companion. Okay, so that nothing be lacking of honor or of dignity in the obedience which she pays. Let divine charity be the constant guide of their mutual relations, both in him who rules and in her who obeys, since each bears the image, the one of Christ, the other of the church, end quote. I really think that these paragraphs, and Heschmeyer brought this out as well, but this is the section I think that Tim Gordon has to deal with, because, again, no one disagrees with what the Roman Catechism says, so we're all on board with that. But Gordon has to take his lens and his filter, which I maintain is warped and is degrading, okay, when it comes to his view of women and of wives and marriage, and he has to find a way to fit it within those paragraphs, and I didn't see an answer for that from him in his response to Heschmeyer. And apparently I wasn't the only one, because, man, people were commenting saying we don't see, what's being said that's contradicting Heschmeyer. All right. So, again, that's something I think that has to be addressed. Okay. The points that Heschmeyer made, the points that I'm making, essentially what Pius XI said stands to be corrected still, but it hasn't been by Timothy Gordon. I don't see Tim Gordon's viewer lens in those sections whatsoever. Again, I find them damaging, if anything. I do not find them in Casti Connubii, unless I'm missing something, okay? But I don't find them in those sections whatsoever. So I think it's very important. Casti Connubii, these paragraphs prove that the wife does have a real moral agency. Her judgment is not erased by the husband's mere preferences. Because Pius XI is clear, right? A wife must not obey any command that is irrational, harmful, sinful, contrary to her conscience properly formed. This is what we draw out of what Pius XI has to say when it comes to her dignity and when it comes to right reason. All right. So, examples of right reason, okay, just to give you some ideas here. I gave one kind of area, but like financial responsibility would be one example, okay? If a husband insists on squandering family money on a reckless purchase, for example, gambling, a frivolous luxury, an irresponsible investment, then a wife has a duty to say something, right, and to resist it, to speak up. That's not disobedience, that's being obedient to right reason. All right, so that's very important. That's why I was saying even the initial question that Heschmeyer was addressing with the purchase of the car, there's a lot of context not there. So it's kind of hard to say at times, but there's just so much context missing. Another example has to do with physical or mental harm. If a husband demands a wife to participate in something that is harmful to health or safety, then she has to say no. Okay. Another example: neglect of children. If a husband forbade proper medical care, education, moral formation for the children, she has a right to speak up. Okay. Another example: social conduct. If a husband demands that she break ties unjustly, harm her own personal reputation, neglect duties to her parents, right? She needs to speak up on these things, okay? And encourage him to see a spiritual director, right? None of these things are sins in themselves, and yet they all contradict right reason. So, which places them outside the normative objective scope of obedience. That's the key thing, normative and objective. All right, we're talking about exceptions. We're talking about nuance, specific things, okay? Again, Aquinas in the Summa says a human act is good when it's in accord with right reason, and bad when it's discordant from right reason, right? He also says right reason is the measure of human actions. So right reason is the rational judgment that conforms to the objective moral order established by God. It's not merely the husband's preference. It's not his every whim, impulse, emotion, or desire. Okay, that's where, again, I think Gordon goes completely off the rails in the way he approaches this thing. The correct use of reason that conforms to natural law, divine law, virtue, prudence, and the objective moral order. Right? This is what we're talking about when we talk about right reason. So that means it's rational, not impulsive. It's ordered to the true good. It's not self-indulgent. It respects justice, prudence, and the duties of one's state of life. It avoids harm, recklessness, and imprudence. It's aligned with God's law and with the responsibilities of family life. Right reason is reason ordered to God's will and to the moral law. So that's what Pius XI means when he says this subjection does not demand that she obey his every request if not in harmony with right reason. When Pius XI does this, he's invoking the entire Thomistic tradition when he does it, meaning if the husband's command is irrational, okay, she's not obliged. If it's imprudent, she's not obliged. If it harms family finances, children, or her personal well-being, she's not obliged. If it contradicts virtue, justice, or common sense, she's not obliged. If it violates conscience or moral law, she is not obliged, right? Right reason stands above the preferences of the husband. It stands above his personal whims and fancies on a given day, okay, or his emotional thoughts on a given moment, okay? So, Catholic moral theology has never taught blind obedience to a fallible human authority, ever, okay? Right reason, according to Catholic tradition, is the correct use of human reason in conformity with God's moral law, natural law, and the virtues. And Aquinas teaches that right reason is the measure of human action. Pius XI applies this to marriage when he says a wife is not bound to obey her husband when his request contradicts right reason, meaning when it's irrational, imprudent, unjust, harmful, or contrary to moral duty. Right? That's why Leo XIII, on Christian marriage said the woman, because she's flesh of the flesh and bone of his bone, must be subject to her husband and obey him, but not as a servant, not as a slave, but as his companion. Right? That's what Pius XI was quoting. So that her obedience shall be wanting in neither honor nor dignity. All right? So all very important things. St. Alphonsus Liguori, in his moral theology, following the common doctrine, himself teaches that subordinates are not bound to obey superiors when the command is contrary to the law of God or to the right order of charity. All right? For example, he explicitly denies that the subject must obey a prelate who commands disclosure of a sin, for example, because such a command is against the order of charity. So in the same way, a husband's authority cannot bind his wife to acts that are illicit or that are contrary to sound prudence. And those are two important things. Anyways, these are some of the important principles we get from Aquinas, from Alphonsus Liguori. We get from Alphonsus Liguori the principle that the wife is not bound to obey her husband in anything that's illicit or which is against prudence. We get that principle from his moral theology manual. St. Francis de Sales, verbatim, St. Francis de Sales says, St. Paul assigns the charge of the household to the woman, and consequently some hold that the devotion of the family depends more upon the wife than the husband, who is more frequently absent and has less influence in the house. So the wife must seek that her husband be sweetened with the sugar of devotion, and the husband will desire to see his wife devout. Each should have such forbearance towards the other that they never grow angry or fall into discussion and argument. And you notice he's applying this to both sides, husband and wife, right? To have forbearance towards the other, that neither side, husband or wife, grow angry and fall into a discussion which leads to an argument, okay? Notice how it talks about how the wife should seek that the husband is sweetened with the sugar of devotion. The husband desires to see his wife devout. This again shows you the complementary nature of husband and wife, okay, and how that works in a marriage. And even saying that at times the charged household falls squarely to the woman, okay, for obvious reasons. St. John Chrysostom says some beautiful things. He talking to husbands and wives, saying, "Let your prayers be common. Let each go to church, and let the husband ask his wife at home, and she ask her husband the account of the things which were said and read there. If any married people do this with this view, they will be but little inferior in holiness to the monks." Look at how he says that. Let each go to church, let the husband ask his wife at home, and she ask her husband what was said and read there. In other words, they're discussing the readings, they're discussing the sermon, right? They're growing from each other. That's what St. John Chrysostom says. This is practice my wife and I have done since we've been married. Going to Mass and leaving Mass and discussing what were your thoughts on the readings, what were your thoughts on the sermon. And that, so even Chrysostom's promoting that whole idea. This is also more from St. John Chrysostom. He says, and this again is verbatim, he says, "You have seen the measure of obedience. Now hear also the measure of love. Would you have your wife obedient unto you as the church is to Christ? Take then yourself the same provident care for her as Christ does for the church. Yes, even if it shall be needful for you to give your life for her. Yes, and even if you had to be cut up into pieces 10,000 times to endure and undergo any suffering whatever, don't refuse it. Though you should undergo all of this, yet will you not, no, not even then, have done anything like Christ. For thou indeed art doing it for one to whom you are already knit together." He's talking about the husband to the wife. "For he says, but he for one who turned her back on him and hated him," talking about Christ and the church. And he says, "In the same way then as he laid his feet, her who turned her back on him, who hated and spurned, disdained him, not by menaces, nor by violence, nor by terror, nor by anything else of the kind, but by his unwearied affection, so also do thou behave yourself towards your wife. Yes, though thou see her looking down upon you and disdaining and scorning you, yet by your great thoughtfulness for her, by affection, by kindness, you'll be able to lay her at your feet. For there is nothing more powerful to sway than these bonds." He's talking there again about what? Your thoughtfulness towards her, your affection, your kindness towards her, being used to sway your wife to you, to trust in you, right? He says, "A servant indeed, one will be able perhaps to bind down by fear, for he will soon start away and be gone. But the partner of one's life, the mother of one's children, the foundation of one's every joy, one ought never to chain down by fear and by menaces, but with love and with a good temper. For what sort of union is that where the wife trembles at her husband? What sort of pleasure will the husband himself enjoy if he dwells with his wife the way he would with a slave, and not as a free woman? Yes, though you should suffer anything on her account, do not upbraid her, for neither did Christ do this." Right? So, I mean, look at such powerful words from an early great church father on how husbands ought to deal with their wives and, in a sense, win them over to them, right? He's not talking about the approach that Tim Gordon uses. He's talking about an approach that is virtuous in accordance with self-sacrificial love, recognizing the honor and dignity of your wife. That's what he's talking about, okay? St. Ambrose, in his work on Abraham, in Book 1, says, "You are not her master, you're her husband. You don't have a slave, you have a wife. Render the obedience that is due and repay gratitude in return." All right, some translations in the English from the Latin talk about, when it says render the obedience due, it's translated as reciprocate her attentiveness towards you. Reciprocate that towards her, right? St. Augustine again says, "Marriage is a friendship in which each helps the other to attain God." Each helps one another to attain God. Notice that St. Augustine teaches that marriage is a friendship that's ordered towards salvation. And in friendships that are ordered towards salvation, mutual admonition and encouragement are duties of both out of charity for one another's soul, right? So you have Tim saying things like a wife can never really disagree with her husband's prudential decisions. For example, buying an expensive car when money is tight, he says she has to accept it while smiling, okay? He compares her submission to that of a teenager, saying it's similar to a legal minor under guardianship. He talks about right reason does not justify a wife even verbally disagreeing with an obvious decision that's imprudent or reckless, as long as it's not a formal mortal sin. And what I'm trying to show is that a wife is truly subject to her husband, but she can disagree and raise her voice and share her concerns with him at minimum in things that are in anything that's sinful or against right reason. And she retains her real liberty, dignity, and voice through the whole process. And out of charity, she ought to be doing such things. St. Gregory of Nazianzen, another early church father, in his funeral oration for his father, talked about how his father was converted by the prayers, the influence, the example, and the words of his own wife, St. Nona, who was St. Gregory's mother. It's a beautiful oration to read, but he talks all about the influence that his mother had on his father and how she instructed him in matters of the faith. Okay, so again, we see that even from one of the early church fathers, St. Gregory of Nazianzen. He credits the conversion of his father truly to the work of his own mother, to his father's wife, St. Nona. Okay, some scenarios that we can go over to talk about, issues that are that allow the wife to disagree, to speak up, and at times when need be to have to disagree. Okay, so here's one scenario: destroying the family finances out of impulsiveness. All right, the husband decides on an impulse to purchase a $90,000 sports car, which drains the emergency fund and leaves the family unable to meet rent or medical needs. Okay, purchasing a car is not sinful per se, but this example is gravely contrary to right reason, and it directly harms the welfare of the children in that regard, right, financially. It lies outside the rightful scope of the husband's authority, which exists for the good of the family, not against the good of the family. All right, another scenario, refusing necessary medical treatment for a child on irrational grounds. So if a husband says, I'm not going to have my child go to that doctor, even though he has a severe fever, but I don't trust that doctor, even though the situation obviously is clearly very urgent. Okay, again, it's not per se necessarily a sin, but it can be gravely imprudent. It can threaten the child's well-being, and the wife has a moral duty to protect her children in that regard. Here's another one: forbidding the wife to contact her parents. Right? Let's say a husband demands that she permanently cease all communication with her family, with her immediate family, not for any issue of safety or moral reasons, but simply out of jealousy or just an insecurity, or on a power trip. Okay? The marriage authority does not extend to destroying natural family bonds without a serious cause. And that would violate what Pius XI calls for legitimate human rights. That's an example of unreasonable domination, not proper holy headship of a husband. Okay, another example, demanding that the wife break long-standing commitments or duties without reason. So, for example, husband saying, don't teach catechism anymore to the children because I don't like that. I don't like it. I don't want you to. Okay, no moral reason given, no family reason. It's just purely arbitrary. All right. This is where authority has to be exercised reasonably, not at the whim of the husband's emotions or thoughts on a given moment. All right, arbitrary commands fall outside the rightful use of headship. All right, what about an example? Anyone that's ever been raised by, I've heard so many stories of people raised by abusive parents. We know that children are supposed to render proper obedience to their parents, right? But look at some of the examples here to give you an idea. What about a parent who demands of the teenager not eat for 24 hours to build discipline? Okay, it's not that it's inherently sinful per se, but it's irrational, it's unhealthy, it's outside responsible parental authority. Okay, a parent that forbids a child from using a prescribed asthma medication because they don't trust inhalers. Again, not sinful, but it's gravely imprudent, and the child has a moral right to preserve life and health. A parent commanding the child to quit school immediately, quote, because I'm just tired of paying for the gas to take you there. All right, that exceeds reasonable parental authority. A parent that demands a child stay awake all night to teach them responsibility. All right, this is abuse of authority. The child has no moral duty to obey an irrational command such as that. All right, and there's many other examples we can give. A parent forbidding a child from talking to their grandparents without any cause. Okay, a parent ordering a child to give all their birthday money to the parent's gambling habit, which would be irrational and violates justice and promotes reckless spending. Okay, so if obedience were absolute, right, the way that we find in Gordon's views, right, then a wife would have to smile and nod even when her husband says, hey, honey, hey, babe, I'm draining our savings today to buy a $90,000 sports car because I'm bored and I want to do it. And she's supposed to just nod, smile, and say, oh, sounds great, babe. Go ahead, why don't you do that? Okay, and, that's not Catholic teaching. That's what we would call insanity. Right, absolutely. The wife can, at minimum again, say something. Because Gordon's even making that she can't say something. She has to smile and go along with it. No, she can speak up and say something, right, when that happens. If a husband were to say, stop all contact with your parents forever because I'm jealous, again, that's unreasonable, it's controlling, it's harmful. So I mean, these are just examples, right? Pius XI teaches that she is not bound to obey anything that violates right reason or her dignity as a wife. That's the important part, right? So, again, the phrase that's the moral boundary line, not inconsistent with Christian piety, right? That's the key phrase right there. A wife does not have to obey or can offer up her concerns with her husband whenever the command contradicts faith, morals, virtue, reason, justice, prudence, the good of children, or her God-given dignity as a person. All right, so again, all these things that we've covered that are an important nuance to understand, because Gordon does not want to deal with the nuance of these situations. It's either you're here with him or you're a Christian feminist, and that's the way it is. You're here or you're just a weak, you're a weak example of a Catholic husband, and that's just the way it is, right? So that's why these nuances are very important to understand. Okay. So let me see. So some other notes that are very important as well to go over. One of the things I did in preparing for this podcast was looking at early 20th century Catholic authors and moral theologians to see what their comments were on Casti Connubii after it was released in 1930. I was curious to what was being discussed, commentaries on this encyclical of Pius XI, right? I came across some very, interesting topics, very interesting things. One case in particular, Father Arthur Vermersch, 1932, in a book called What is Marriage? A Catechism Arranged According to Casti Connubii. All right. This is the most authoritative commentary of that time on Casti Connubii, because it was written for the express purpose of explaining the encyclical in catechetical format. Okay. Here's what this priest had to say on wifely subjection. Quote, "This subordination is not slavery. It is limited by right reason and by the dignity of the wife. Therefore, she is not obliged to obey commands that are unreasonable or unworthy of a Christian woman." On limits of obedience, he wrote, "No one may command what is sinful, nor anything contrary to the divine or natural law. Hence, the wife is not bound in conscience to obey such a command of her husband." He also wrote, "The woman retains her full personal dignity. The husband's authority is real, but it is the authority of one who loves, not one who dominates. The headship of the husband is an order of love, not of tyranny. Where he fails in his duty, the wife may and must act according to prudence for the good of the family." All right. Another author, Father William Healy, 1948, in his book Marriage Guidance, quotes Pius XI verbatim and then applies the principle. Okay. He in his commentary on Casti Connubii, Father Healy wrote, quote, "This subjection does not bid her obey her husband's every request, if not in harmony with right reason or the dignity due to a wife. A husband may not demand what is unreasonable, degrading, or morally wrong. In such matters, the wife may not only refuse, but has the duty to refuse. The Pope teaches clearly that the wife's dignity places limits on the husband's authority. The Christian home is ruled by charity, not by domination." Okay. Father Vincent McNabb, 1933, on his book Casti Connubii, a commentary. This is a Thomistic commentator, okay, who explicitly comments line by line on the encyclical. All right. And on the right reason and dignity clause, he writes, quote, "Pius XI affirms that the wife is not a slave. Her obedience is bounded by reason and by dignity. She may not be commanded to act against conscience or Christian prudence. The husband's headship is one of service. Where reason or justice is violated, the wife's obedience ceases to be obedience and becomes servility, which the church rejects." All right. Another book, early 20th century, by T.J. Gerard, Father Gerard, Marriage and Parenthood, the Catholic Ideal, where he frequently quotes Casti Connubii and applies it on a pastoral level. He writes, quote, "The Pope is careful to forbid any notion that subjection implies inferiority or license for unreasonable demands. The wife's dignity is safeguarded by the law of right reason. The moral law remains the wife's supreme guide. If a husband commands what is contrary to reason or virtue, she is not bound to obey." Another one by Father Jacques Leclerc in his book Marriage and the Family in the 1940s. This is a Catholic philosopher who quotes Casti Connubii frequently. And he writes, quote, "Authority in the family is limited by the same moral law that governs all authority. It ceases to bind when it ceases to be rational or just. Thus, the wife retains her full dignity within the order established by God." This was another important one. This comes from 1951 from Bouskiran and Ellis, Canon Law, a Text and Commentary. This was a standard seminary textbook in the U.S. prior to the Second Vatican Council. And on marital obedience, it teaches that the wife is not obliged to obey in matters sinful, degrading, dangerous, or unreasonable. All right, that's an important reference book to understand in regards to the role of marital obedience, okay? Just as important comes from Father Charles Augustine in his commentary on the 1970 Code of Canon Law. This was a massive 8-volume commentary. And in regards to marital authority, I had to translate this one from the Latin, but what he teaches is the principle that the husband's authority over the wife is ordered to the good of the family, not to the arbitrary will of man. Okay? Whatever's against the law of God or against uprightness does not bind her. No wife is bound to obey in anything forbidden by divine law, natural law, or good morals. All right, so these are some of the important things for Catholics to understand. Now, before I wrap up this podcast, there's a couple things I want to address. One had to do with a photo that Tim Gordon posted in regards to a wife speaking up, talking back, or sharing her opinion. It was a wife in a medieval contraptment known as a bridal. All right, I'm gonna pull the picture up here on the podcast so you can see the post that I'm talking about. And I found this to be very degrading, and I found the idea of promoting it as being borderline abusive. I thought it was not. There's no reason to show that as trying to prove your point that a wife can't, speak up or say something. But I do think it's important to understand that the bridal itself, which was, again, from the medieval era, was not a Catholic. It wasn't instituted by the Catholic Church. Okay, no pope, council, canon law, Catholic moral theology ever approved the use of the scold's bridle, ever. The Catholic Church never taught that scolds should be punished with instruments of humiliation. Okay, it's not these torture instruments were not anything that was ever talked about positively by the church. Okay, but what it was used by was local civil governments. Okay, historically, local civil governments, especially common in Scotland, a nation that was not Catholic after the Protestant Revolution. And so we find it going there. We find it in some parts of England in the 1500s, the 1700s. Again, also post-Protestant Revolution under Protestant rule. Certain territories in Germany, but used primarily by secular towns, not by clergy. Catholic regions tended not to use the scold's bridle. Okay, it was used by local governments. It was very rare to be used. And it was primarily used for as a local punishment for scolding or for gossip. That's why it was used, man or woman. Okay, so I think it's important to understand. I thought that was entirely wrong of Gordon to do. Even if it was half-hearted, but just again, it's not a good thing to do. To bring it up as an example to prove your point. But yeah, the fact that it wasn't approved by the Catholic Church at any authoritative level. And not something specific to a wife, for example. Okay, so I think that's important to understand. It was never created, endorsed, or administered by the Catholic Church. The last point I want to bring up had to do with, again, Gordon's language. Now, again, there's a lot you're going to find in the podcast I did last year regarding this topic. There's a lot you'll find in my Masculine Crisis series painting this topic about, modesty of speech and how Catholics talk. Okay, and I don't believe, I've been on record for a long time saying that men have to work very hard. The way that men are always talking about modesty with women and how they dress, the sin of immodesty versus modest dress, we have to apply that as men to the way we speak. And modest speaking versus modest speaking. All right. And Timothy Gordon, on his ex-Twitter account, was trying to use Sirach 26:25 to justify calling Lila Rose the B word, which of course I'm not going to repeat.
It is the passive-aggressive, constipated, frigid Christian of telling you to go F off. I'll pray for you, Pearl.
It's the son.
Because I believe it's a sin to do so. He was using it in a vulgar way, and he's used this word several times of women. All right, which again, this is not something that's in accord with virtue. It's not in accord with chivalry. It's one of the reasons why, too, I encourage men not to listen to Tim Gordon and other influencers who freely use words like this, okay? Because they're not imitating St. Joseph. St. Joseph would not use words like this. Our Lord would not use words like this of women. All right? But Tim Gordon does this with Lila Rose, and he's used it several other times. The important thing to understand is that, he uses Sirach 26:25 to justify it. Sirach is using ancient Semitic moral imagery, okay, not modern sexualized profanity in talking about women. The Hebrew word kalev, which is where we get the word dog, is a symbol of shameless behavior, but it's not used as a sexually explicit slur or a misogynistic insult. It's not used in a vulgar way towards women. It was a moral category, not a label that you slap on a person to demean them. So to take an ancient idiom like this and turn it into a license to use modern profanity is abusive eisegesis. It's reading your own vulgarity into the Bible and trying to justify your sin and your vice. All right. If anyone thinks that Sirach is permitting calling a woman the B word, then they are ignoring the numerous times that Scripture tells us to do the exact opposite. From Ephesians, from Colossians, St. Paul saying, don't let corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, right? Put away blasphemy, filthy speech out of your mouth. Our Lord placing insults in the realm of serious sin. James chapter 3, talking about how the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. These things ought not to be so. Anyone that's using Sirach 26:25 to excuse vulgar insults is contradicting the teachings of Scripture and going against the principles of virtue and of chivalry. All right. Scripture uses harsh terms in moral teaching, but never as a permission for personal insults. When biblical writers use terms like fool, adulteress, or dog, they're teaching general moral truths. Okay, they're using objective category language, but they're not attacking individuals with degrading slurs. All right. The church fathers emphasize that this type of language across the board, when the fathers talk about profanity, vulgarity, obscenity, even cursing, these all have distinct definitions, but they're always discussed in the same context with each other. There's a reason for that, because it's damaging language. It's using the tongue for something damaging. Okay, the fathers never use this type of language ever in a vindictive type of way towards anybody. All right, that's the important part to understand. It's a moral category. It's not meant to be used to degrade women. All right, so it's grave matter when that's done knowingly and deliberately. All right, that's the important part to understand. So I want to make sure that I got that part out as well. Because, I think Gordon, again, is completely wrong in doing this, and it's a scandal to do it publicly. Right? It's a complete scandal. They encourage other men to talk this way, too, when men should be trying to grow in virtue and aim for heaven. Right? Not talking the way the world does. Okay? So Sirach 26:25 describes a moral category in ancient Hebrew, not a license to use vulgar, degrading slurs. Scripture forbids filthy speech, personal insults, reviling of any sort, and Christ himself condemns insulting language. So using Sirach to excuse calling a woman the B word is abusing Scripture and contradicting Catholic morality. To do it publicly is a public sin of scandal to your followers. So, anyways, these are some of my summary thoughts on the whole back and forth between Gordon and Heschmeyer, and all that kind of went in between there. And hopefully, this helps. Hopefully it makes sense. And I encourage men, again, watch my podcast from a year ago with Jesse Evans on these topics, on Tim Gordon. Go through my Catholic Masculinity Crisis series and my Iron Sharpens Iron series. And, let's strive to be saints, imitating St. Joseph, imitating our Lord. Let's be husbands of virtue, husbands of chivalry, and let us aim to aspire to nothing less than the example of St. Joseph to our wives, especially, those of us blessed with holy, virtuous, godly women as our wives. Let us aspire to be the very best we can be in sanctity for them. Thanks for listening, and God bless all of you. St. Joseph, pray for us.